Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back again this morning and to be talking about some New Testament texts. We'll look first at Hebrews, which is a text that is very close to my heart, and then move to Romans. And I just want to say, when we move to Romans, we'll be doing a bit more of an exploratory approach. I'm still thinking through, all of this, but Romans in particular. So it'll be fine if there's questions and feedback, if not during the lecture afterwards. Okay, but let's move into Hebrews. The basic argument that I want to present this morning as we think about Hebrews is that Jesus' ascension and his return to his heavenly Father's presence are depicted in Hebrews in terms of the spaces and directionality of sacrifice. And specifically, they're depicted in terms of the high priest entering the Holy of Holies once a year on the Day of Atonement to offer a sacrifice of blood. Hebrews, more than any other text in the New Testament, explicitly connects the way that it reflects on who Jesus is and what Jesus has done and continues to do with the Levitical sacrificial system. We probably all know the theological tradition of identifying Jesus as a high priest. But it is only the text of Hebrews in the entire New Testament that explicitly calls Jesus a high priest. There's evidence in other New Testament texts, so please don't mishear me on this point, but no other text says explicitly that Jesus is a high priest. So this clearly matters for the author of Hebrews. Now, unsurprisingly, many modern interpreters assume that when Hebrews reflects on the crucifixion, Hebrews identifies the crucifixion as Jesus' sacrifice. Or to put it differently, many modern interpreters think that what Hebrews is trying to do is to give us the spiritual or heavenly significance of the earthly historical event of the crucifixion. So for many, not all, but for many New Testament interpreters in the last couple hundred years, the book of Hebrews has been read as if it were taking the historical event of the cross and overlaying onto that historical event a kind of heavenly or spiritual perspective. And this, of course, is often discussed in terms of metaphor, that Jesus is metaphorically a high priest, and that Jesus is dying on the cross metaphorically as a sacrifice. Now, this is a very broad brush caricature, okay? But this is not an uncommon way of reading Hebrews. And when you read Hebrews this way, it's very easy to start making certain assumptions. For example, it becomes almost self-evident that when Jesus died on the cross, he's dying on an altar. And this is in fact the altar where he is offering himself to God as a sacrifice. And then you can read verses like Hebrews 10:10. We have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. Now, if we were to ask, where is this offering taking place? When did it happen? When did Jesus offer his body? For many interpreters, this verse is almost a proof text that this is the cross. This is the death of Jesus. For now, I just want you to notice that the text says nothing about the cross. Where is it? It's just not there. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the author's not talking about the cross. I mean, this is part of how human communication works. We assume all kinds of things. I was talking to some students yesterday, but if I were to say that I had a trip to Australia planned in 2020, now let me just stop there. I'm fairly certain that everyone in this room will know at least two things. One, I did not take the trip. I had to cancel the trip. And 2, you'll know the reason why I had to cancel the trip, because of COVID. It would be almost pedantic for me to explain to you why that I canceled the trip and why I had to cancel the trip. I can simply assume it, because we all know. So it's entirely possible that the author of Hebrews is assuming the cross here, right? But what if there are other assumptions in play? Then we'll come back to that, okay? Now, here is, again, a significant chunk of text, Hebrews 9:24 through 26. The main things I want us to notice here is that the author talks in terms of Christ entering the heavenly tabernacle and going into the presence of God and actually ministering before the face of God. That's priestly language. It shows up especially in Ezekiel, where the priests stand before the face of God. That's the language that's used. So Jesus has entered directly into the presence of God, and he's entered into this heavenly tabernacle space, which is associated with heaven. This conceptually looks like Jesus is being presented as entering into the heavenly Holy of Holies in the heavenly tabernacle, and there ministering for us. And there he puts away, at the very end, in verse 26, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Once again, we're faced with the question of assumption. What does the sacrifice of himself mean? Many commentators, again, are going to read this as that's the crucifixion. But notice again, the cross is nowhere explicitly present. Doesn't necessarily mean it's not assumed, but it's just worth noticing that sort of like, I was talking to someone earlier this morning who was saying, like, I always just knew that animals were killed on the altar. Like, well, yes, so did I. I mean, you look at many pictures of sacrifice, this is how it's depicted, like the painting that we showed yesterday. We simply read this into the text because we know that that's how it works. Until we stop and notice that, wait, the text doesn't actually say that. So could something else be going on? In a similar way, we simply tend to read language like Jesus putting away sin with the sacrifice of himself and think, well, that's the cross. But that's a modern assumption. Not strictly speaking, only modern, but it's an assumption, okay? And it's at least worth asking, are there other assumptions? And might they better explain or offer other plausible explanations for what's going on in Hebrews? So Hebrews makes claims about Jesus appearing before the Father in the heavenly Holy of Holies as a sacrifice, and these are often taken to be metaphorical language to explain the saving or atoning significance of Jesus' death in sacrificial terms. So to put this in a different way, many think that the author of Hebrews is taking the historical event of the crucifixion and trying to use Levitical sacrifice as a way to explain the significance of that singular, once-for-all event. Okay? All right. Now, I mean, after the lecture yesterday, you probably won't be surprised that I have some questions. I think there are some problems with this interpretation of Hebrews and this account of Jesus' sacrifice. For starters, this is an account of sacrifice that is reductive. It reduces sacrifice to a single event, and it tends to be an account of sacrifice that assumes that sacrifice is slaughter on an altar. Now, perhaps Hebrews thinks that, okay? But if the author of Hebrews thinks in these ways, then hopefully from what we talked about yesterday, it becomes immediately clear that this is not an author who understands Levitical sacrifice. That's possible, right? I would also, though, just put in a slightly different perspective. it's entirely possible, just maybe the case, that presumably this Jewish author from some 2,000 years ago understands Jewish sacrifice better than I do as a Gentile reader 2,000 years later. Just maybe, okay? Of course, that has to be tested. But I want to just start by saying, look, if the common reading of Hebrews is correct, then we have a problem. We have a problem with the fact that this is viewing sacrifice simply as slaughter and viewing it as slaughter that occurs on an altar. But another point, this view emphasizes one part of the larger process that, at least within the Levitical accounts, appears to be less significant in the hierarchy of the process than is the act of bringing the gift into the presence of God. Think back to Ezekiel 44 that we looked at yesterday. The Levites, who led the people astray, bear their punishment. They get to serve in the temple, but their service is limited to some of the housekeeping matters. And that includes slaughtering some of the sacrifices. What they do not get to do, what only the Zadokite priests are allowed to do, because they were faithful to God, is bring the gift into the presence of God. They, as it were, get to stand before the face of God, and the Levites do not. So right there is a distinction between, at least in some cases, the act of slaughter as necessary for sacrifice, at least animal sacrifice, but as not the central part of sacrifice, because it's only the priests who are not punished but rewarded for their faithfulness, who are allowed to bring the sacrifice into the presence of God. So that's another problem. But there's a third problem, and we're going to spend a bit more time on this. Hebrews works with an incarnational Christology. And this incarnational Christology views Jesus as offering himself as a sacrifice to God, not when he dies on the cross, I will argue, but rather when he ascends into God's heavenly presence. Now, given the common interpretation that the cross is the place where Jesus offers himself to God, this incarnational Christology creates a problem. And the problem is this: if the eternal Son of God becomes for a little while lower than the angels, comes to earth. In fact, Hebrews 3:1 will talk about Jesus as the one who was sent, the apostle, and dies on the cross, only to then ascend into the presence of the Father in the heavenly tabernacle. If his death on the cross is where he offers the sacrifice to God, how is he doing that away from the presence of God? This makes very little sense. The directions are all wrong. Jesus goes away from God and offers the sacrifice. Then after he offers the sacrifice, he then goes into the heavenly tabernacle. That makes no sense from a Levitical perspective. So we're going to talk about this because the common account has some problems, and we need to think about the way in which Hebrews presents this incarnational logic to see if we can find other plausible assumptions in play that might make better sense of what we actually see in the text. So in the very beginning of Hebrews, we have a puzzle. This is a curious puzzle that has kept interpreters working and writing for millennia now. And it's basically this. On the one hand, the Son of God is presented as being right there with the Father in language that comes close to, if not equals, equivalence. The Son of God is even the one through whom the entire universe is sustained or held together. He sustains it by his own powerful word. There are other parts in Hebrews which make it clear that the Son of God is the one who creates all things. This is the kind of language that in a Jewish context would normally be applied to the Father, to God. So we have what begins with we can use the language of a very high Christology. But then we immediately have this idea that in Hebrews 1:4, that after he makes purification for sins, he sits down at the right hand of the Majesty, having become superior to the angels, to the extent that the name he inherited is more excellent than theirs. Now, that is very odd. Because think about the assumption in that statement. The Son of God, who created and sustains all things, presumably he created the angels. And their very existence is dependent on the Son himself. Somehow was given an inheritance and became superior to the angels whom he created? How does that make sense? What could it possibly mean for the Creator Son to in some way be less than the angels, such that he could then be elevated above the angels? This is a puzzle. I hope everyone can feel the tension in these verses. Again, sometimes we read right across these. I mean, it's wonderful language. But sometimes we don't really sort of savor and chew on the assumptions and tensions that are present. And these tensions run straight through Hebrews chapter 1. For the sake of time, though, we need to move forward. Because this puzzle, the author is, I'm convinced, completely aware of what he's doing. He wants you to start thinking about this. He wants you to start asking, how is it the case that the Son was made greater than the angels? And he then presents the resolution or solution to the puzzle in Hebrews chapter 2. And he does this by interpreting Psalm 8. In Hebrews chapter 2, verses 6 through 9, the author quotes from Psalm 8. This is a slightly paraphrased translation. What are human beings that you, God, are mindful of them? What is the Son of Man that you care about him? You made humanity for a little while lower than the angels. Yet you crowned them with glory and honor, putting everything in subjection to their feet. That's the citation of Psalm 8. Notice the motif of being for a little while lower than the angels. This is exactly the status that we saw attributed to the Son implicitly when it says that he was elevated above the angels. It presupposes that he was, at least for a little while, lower than the angels. Now here's Hebrews' interpretation of Psalm 8. In putting everything in subjection to humanity, God left nothing outside of their control. Very good Genesis 1 theology. At present, however, we do not yet see everything in subjection to humanity. But we do see the one who was, for a little while, made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, now crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death. Here we see Jesus. And Jesus is identified as the Son of God, who was made for a little while lower than the angels, but is now exalted to the status of ruler of all things, above the angels. Jesus fulfills the promise of Psalm 8. But he fulfills the promise of Psalm 8 because of two important things. One, he's the Son of God who created the angels and was made for a little while lower than them. And two, he was made for a little while lower by becoming a human being. And it is precisely because he became a human being that he can then be elevated above the angels. Why? Because that's what Psalm 8 promises. Psalm 8 says humanity will be elevated above the angels. The solution then, jumping ahead of myself just a bit here, but let's look at Hebrews 2:14 through 16, where we see this incarnational claim clearly stated. Because the children, the brothers and sisters of the Son of God, share in flesh and blood, the Son of God likewise partook of the same things, so that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver all those who through the fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. Now, before we go further, I just want to quickly point here to the logic of redemption from slavery that is present at the end of this text. And notice that it is directly correlated with the death of Jesus. This is something that I suggested was even yesterday is already a key part of the salvific work that the crucifixion does. We can call it atoning if we want, but it's not the same kind of work that sacrifice does to purify people and maintain covenant relationship. Okay? But this is absolutely an essential, a without which there is no salvation, salvific work, defeating the devil by himself going through death. Notice, though, that Hebrews links this with the Son of God taking on blood and flesh and participating in the human condition so that he might himself die and liberate people from the fear of death. Here, then, we have a fairly clear claim that the Son of God became lower than the angels by becoming a human being, specifically by becoming the human being Jesus. This is a deeply incarnational logic and claim. And this is the resolution to the puzzle of Hebrews chapter 1. By becoming human, the eternal Son of God, the one who created the angels, by becoming human, was made for a little while lower than the angels. It is precisely by continuing to be human that the eternal Son of God is then, according to the terms of Psalm 8, elevated above the angels. And here, of course, I did actually put Psalm 110. Hebrews is reading Psalm 8 together with Psalm 110. To whom did God promise the royal position at his own right hand? Psalm 110 says that he promised this position to the Davidic scion, the coming Davidic king. Jesus has to be a human being to participate in the line of David, and in part to be qualified to sit at that throne at God's right hand. But it is also because of the logic of Psalm 8, which promises that at some point, humans who are now a little while lower than the angels will one day be put in a position of rule and authority over the angels. And the writer says, you look at our reality today and we don't see that. But we see Jesus, who is exactly the fulfillment of that promise. This is the resolution to the puzzle in Hebrews chapter 1. The eternal Son of God was made lower than the angels for a little while when he became a human being. But then, because he remains a human being, was also then elevated above the angels when he returned to the Father and was, according to Psalm 110, invited to sit at God's right hand. Okay, now I think I've pretty much said all of this, but the point I want to make here is, for most readers of Hebrews, the death of Jesus is, as I noted, assumed to be the sacrifice, the point at which he presents himself to the Father as a sacrifice. But how does that work within this incarnational logic? Precisely because, as I noted, the direction is wrong. If Hebrews imagines that the cross is the place where the Son offers his body to God as a sacrifice, then Hebrews also must imagine that the Son left his Father's heavenly presence to be made lower than the angels and to offer his sacrifice outside of the heavenly tabernacle. After making the sacrifice, after dying on the cross on earth, then the Son returns to the Father's presence and enters the heavenly tabernacle, where he does what a high priest does. Except, stop. The high priest goes into the Holy of Holies to do what? Offer a sacrifice. But he's already offered the sacrifice on earth. So what is going on? This is where this model really begins to, in my view, fall apart. Again, assuming that this author is working with a Jewish logic of sacrifice, this begins to border on the nonsensical. It's not really taking Levitical sacrifice seriously at all. The conceptual directions are completely wrong. You don't offer God a sacrifice by going away from his presence in the tabernacle. You offer him the sacrifice by going into his presence in the tabernacle. And that suggests then that there's a major problem with this common reading of Hebrews, because it's not able to correlate or link the incarnational logic of the text in a reasonable or plausible way with the actual ways in which Levitical sacrifice seems to have operated. Okay? All right. And there's a fourth view, which I've spent a lot of time working on in other contexts. I'm going to gloss over it, but I just want to name it, because it's already implied in what I've said. That is, this view that Jesus offers his sacrifice on earth tends to be linked with downplaying or ignoring Jesus' bodily resurrection in Hebrews. Now, those are fighting words in the world of Hebrew scholarship. I'll touch on it just briefly, or I'll try to clarify my own position here just briefly. The idea that Jesus, when he returns to the presence of the Father, is invited to be the one who sits at the right hand of the Majesty on high, and the idea that the angels are then commanded to worship that one, is predicated on Psalm 8. And Psalm 8 says that the figure in that position must be a human being. And that, I suggest, requires, since humanity is defined by Hebrews as being blood and flesh, this requires the bodily resurrection of Jesus. So that what he actually is when he stands before the Father, when he returns to serve before the face of God, is not just a human being, but a human being who is the seed of Abraham. And not just the seed of Abraham, but of the tribe of Judah. These are points that Hebrews actually makes in chapter 2 and chapter 7. And it's precisely these things which qualify the Son of God, per the biblical promises, Psalm 110, Psalm 8, to be the one elevated above and worshipped by the angels. Yes, he deserves all of that because of his eternal divine nature. I'm not disputing that. It's just that in the logic of these biblical texts and in the argument of Hebrews, it is the incarnation, and specifically the resurrection and ascension, that Hebrews is identifying as being those things which make the humanity of the eternal Son worthy to sit at the Father's right hand and be worshipped by the angels. Okay, I want to now propose a different approach on the back of those problems that I've just noted. I want to suggest that we should try reading Hebrews as viewing the sacrifice of Jesus, his offering himself to the Father, as exactly what happens when he returns to the Father by ascending through the heavens and entering the Holy of Holies in the heavenly tabernacle. Let me put that in different language. Hebrews knows how Levitical sacrifice actually operates. And Hebrews is taking it seriously and using Levitical sacrifice as a model to explain what happens not just when Jesus dies, but even more when he ascends into the heavenly realm. Because here, Hebrews is then concluding that if Jesus is this high priest, and he has a sacrifice to offer, and he goes into the presence of God, then he's in the Holy of Holies. And there is one figure in the Old Testament who has a sacrifice to offer, who goes into the presence of God by entering the Holy of Holies. He does it once a year, and he does it to offer blood. Hebrews 9:7 says this explicitly. And that figure is the Jewish high priest. And the day in which the high priest enters the presence of God in the Holy of Holies is the Day of Atonement. This is Leviticus 16. So notice that Hebrews says that this great high priest Jesus has passed through the heavens. Hebrews 4:14. And he also says in 9:24 that Christ didn't enter into the holy places made with hands, that is the tabernacle or temple on earth. Rather, he entered heaven itself. And why did he do this? To do what priests do, to appear before the face of God for us. Pro nobis. Now, if this is right, and if we can assume that Jesus' bodily resurrection is important for Hebrews, then Hebrews is assuming that the humanity of the Son of God is how the Son was made lower. But it is also precisely the humanity, the risen and perfected, perfection is a major motif in Hebrews, the risen and perfected humanity of the Son is what the Son then offers the Father when he returns to the Father. This, I suggest, is what Hebrews means when it talks about Jesus offering the sacrifice of himself. He, in his risen humanity, is not only the high priest, but also the sacrifice that he offers. And that sacrifice is perpetually present before the Father. Why? Because the Father invited it to come and sit at his right hand. The absence of Jesus, for Hebrews, is not a problem to be solved. It's an indication that God has accepted the sacrifice and that the high priest is now doing the Day of Atonement work on behalf of his people. We'll come back to this point. But this suggests that Hebrews really does understand Jewish sacrifice. Jesus' ascension through the heavens and entrance into that heavenly tabernacle to serve God or minister on our behalf aligns remarkably well with the directionality of the high priest who goes into the Holy of Holies to offer blood for the people and make atonement for them once a year on the Day of Atonement. The earthly reality provides a model for understanding the heavenly reality. And by the way, in Hebrews, this works because Moses saw the heavenly realities. He went up Sinai, he saw these realities, and God said to him, this is in Hebrews 8:5, quoting Exodus, I think it's 25:40, God said to him, now go make sure that you build everything on earth according to the pattern that you've seen here. So there is a direct inherent set of analogies that are there between the earthly sacrificial system and whatever these heavenly realities are. I'm not suggesting it's a one-to-one, but I am suggesting we should push it, because the author of Hebrews actually draws on the analogies. Now, this suggests that Jesus' sacrifice cannot be reducible to his earthly death. Rather, it culminates in his presentation of himself to the Father. Let's come back to Hebrews 10:10, and let's reread it with these thoughts in mind. If we have assumptions like what we see in Leviticus in view, then suddenly look at how this verse reads very differently. Now, when we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all, it becomes possible to read this not as self-evidently referring to the crucifixion, but as self-evidently referring to the ascension. This is where Jesus presents his body to the Father. In Hebrews chapter 2, he says, "Here I am, and the children God has given me." There's a direct connection between his humanity, being present before the Father, and the other human beings who are redeemed and, as I'll argue, kept saved. The relationship is maintained by means of Jesus' high priestly ministry. Jesus' return to the Father traces the direction of Jewish sacrifice. Moreover, it also works with the same kind of basic space. It's different, of course, because it's the heavenly reality. But spatially, Jesus is said to enter the heavenly tabernacle. And when he does that, he enters the Father's presence and there presents himself, his body, as the sacrifice. And what's more, I didn't mention this yesterday, but there is a close connection between bringing a sacrifice to God and prayer. It is not a one-to-one. It's not as if God needs a sacrifice before he'll listen to your prayer, but there is a very close connection throughout the Old Testament and into the Second Temple period, the literature in the Second Temple period, that when one brings a sacrifice, this is an appropriate time to pray. What I'm arguing here in part is that the ongoing prayer, the ongoing intercession of Jesus is very much in line with this Jewish logic, predicated on, directly tied to, the ongoing presence of the sacrifice in the presence of the Father. Okay, now let's take a moment and look at what I think is one of the more significant verses in the New Testament, certainly in terms of the conversation that we're having. Hebrews 7:25. Consequently, Jesus is able to save completely those who draw near to God through him, because he always lives to intercede for them. Now, I want us to think through some contextual factors as we look at Hebrews 7:25 a bit more closely. First of all, as I've already noted, in 4:14, the author says that Jesus has passed through the heavens as the great high priest. Jesus, as we already noted in 9:24 through 26, not only passed through the heavens as the high priest, but he did so with a particular goal. Why does the high priest pass through the veil and enter into the Holy of Holies? To offer a sacrifice, to minister before God. Not only to minister to God, but to minister on behalf of the people. In the same way, Jesus entered the heavenly Holy of Holies to appear before the Father and present his sacrifice. Jesus, to put this differently, is doing what the high priest does on the Day of Atonement. He is offering blood to God in the Holy of Holies in some way, and he is interceding for his people. Now, this last bit is contested. There's no biblical text, actually, where we have an instance of the high priest going into the Holy of Holies and explicitly being depicted as praying. We do have one little piece of evidence from Philo, who, in his embassy to Gaius, makes the argument that Gaius should not, as part of his argument, that Gaius should not set up an image in the temple in Jerusalem, says, look, this is bad for everybody. Why? Because our high priest goes into the Holy of Holies and prays for the whole world. So we have at least one ancient Jew who's clearly thinking that when the high priest goes into the presence of God, the high priest prays for the world. That seems a fairly logical deduction to draw, based on what I just said earlier about sacrifice and prayer being directly linked. But for the sake of trying to keep ourselves honest here, it's not as if there is a proof text in Leviticus 16 where we see the high priest going into the Holy of Holies and interceding. It's rather a deduction that seems natural, and we have at least evidence of one Jew who made exactly that deduction, Philo. Okay? I suggest Hebrews is working with the same deduction. It is an assumption, I think, for this author, that when the high priest goes into the Holy of Holies to offer blood and incense before the Lord at the Ark of the Covenant, of course it's not there in the Second Temple, but in that space, many people assumed that the high priest also interceded for them when he was in that space offering the sacrifice. Now, if we go back to Hebrews 7:25 with those kinds of contextual factors in view, we can see a couple of interesting things. One, that the author links Jesus' ability to provide complete salvation, or to save to the uttermost, as some translations put it, those who draw near to God. Why? Because he died, of course. Well, yes, but that's not what the author says. The author puts the point of emphasis on the fact that Jesus always lives. And why does that matter? Because if he's always living, then he is able to always intercede on behalf of the people. Jesus' high priestly ministry never, at least in this age, comes to an end. It is ongoing. He is not subject to death like the other high priests are. Hebrews makes this point at the end of chapter 7. He always lives. Why? Well, okay, enter the resurrection again, okay? But that aside, he always lives, and therefore, he is able to provide complete salvation to his people. This, I suggest, is deeply linked with points that we saw yesterday, not least the conception of sacrifice as a process. And what I've said just earlier today, the idea that when you offer a sacrifice, this is an opportune time to pray. So Hebrews is working here with a Jewish imagination. Jesus' ongoing intercession to the Father provides the kind of thing that the Day of Atonement provided once a year. Only Jesus provides it eternally, forever, perpetually is maybe a better word. It's never interrupted. In part because Jesus doesn't go in and out of the heavenly Holy of Holies the way the earthly high priest did. The earthly high priest goes in, makes the sacrifice, presumably intercedes for the people, and then leaves. And he can't come back for a whole year. And then he can go in again. Jesus goes in once for all. And Jesus sits down at the right hand of the Father. And now he is once for all. Because he is in this heavenly space, interceding for his people. This in Hebrews does not come to an end until Jesus returns. In 9:28, the author says that Jesus will appear a second time to bring salvation to those who are waiting for him. So Hebrews is pretty clearly working, I suggest, with this Day of Atonement model, but he is moved from the earthly sphere with its limitations into the heavenly sphere, where those temporal and especially mortal limitations no longer apply. And this is how Jesus can provide complete salvation. And I suggested yesterday just reflecting a bit on what the benefit of an incomplete salvation is. What good is a partial salvation? So, if this thinking is right, there are, I think, a few points that follow. First, Hebrews does not disparage or abandon the basic logic of Jewish sacrifice. On the contrary, Hebrews relies on the logic of Jewish sacrifice. And here I think I'm willing to be a bit more bold in my claim earlier. I'm pretty sure this author understood Jewish sacrifice better than I do. I'm pretty sure that he comes up with this account of Jesus precisely because he takes Jewish sacrifice so seriously. I have made this comment in the past that Anya alluded to. It was when I started to think about sacrifice in these terms. Just a brief autobiography. I had no categories for this. I did not know what to do with it. I quite literally thought, like, I broke Hebrews. Like, I'm just wrong. It cannot be the case that Jesus' sacrifice isn't the cross. That to me was self-evident. I had a thought when this first occurred to me. You know, there's more in Leviticus than just killing an animal. I had never thought about it before. But it was Hebrews that kept pressuring me to look beyond the cross. So I thought, you know, maybe I should go reread Leviticus. So I took an evening, and I read Leviticus straight through in one sitting. Really, it's the first 7 chapters I know now that really matter, but, well, 16 as well. But I just read it straight through, and I asked one question. What does the death of the animal do? And that is when the penny dropped. Because I saw that whatever's going on with the death of the animal, it was only one part of something else that seemed to culminate in going into the presence of God. And that's when the light bulb came on. That's exactly what Hebrews was doing. So I've made this comment that Hebrews made me a more careful reader of Leviticus, and this is why. Hebrews really does seem to be working with these logics that are coming straight out of Jewish sacrificial practice, where the focal point is not the slaughter. It's there. It's important. Without it, you don't have an animal sacrifice. But the focal point is on the blood and the flesh going into the presence of God. And that is exactly what Hebrews seems to be arguing. Second, the superiority of Jesus' sacrifice and ministry are partly rooted in the superior offering that he gives. He offers himself. He makes atonement by bringing humanity back into the presence of God. And says to the Father, it's yours. What was lost has been reclaimed. And it's reclaimed in the ascension. And he offers it in a superior location. He goes into the Father's heavenly presence in the heavenly tabernacle. Jesus gets access to the reality that Moses could only see. Moses saw it. He had some connection with it, which is why he could actually build the earthly tabernacle, set up the Levitical priesthood, and institute the Levitical sacrifices. There is a connection between the heavenly reality and the earthly one. But whereas temporally, we tend to think in terms of the earthly one as being first and the heavenly one coming later, in the eternal reality, the heavenly one pre-exists. The earthly one is based on that, not the other way around. But that does mean that Hebrews brims with analogies between what happens on earth and what happens in heaven. This is Jewish apocalyptic thinking, the kind of stuff we say in the Lord's Prayer. God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. There's a direct link here in the Jewish sacrificial system. And third, Jesus' atoning ministry has to do with his ongoing intercession for his people. This is a ministry that he makes on the basis of always being the sacrifice in God's presence. But what this means is that the atoning work of Jesus is not finished. The sacrificial atoning work of Jesus is going on right now. And it looks like the human being Jesus, elevated into the presence of God, seated at God's right hand, interceding for me and interceding for you. And why do I'm not going to talk about you, but why do I need that ongoing intercession? Because the reality is, I still sin. I need covenant maintenance. And this is exactly what Jesus provides. And it is a superior maintenance. It is able to bring complete salvation. This is sacrificial atonement. Why? Because he always lives to do that intercession. that's a quick run through Hebrews. Let's take a break.